Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm grateful to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. On the first half of today's program, we'll discuss the latest developments to reach a resolution in the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. On the second half of the show, exclusive for Hub heroes and fellows, we'll mark the anniversary of the October 7th terrorist attacks and what we've learned about American leadership in the world, geopolitics, and of course, our own societies. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you, Sean.
David, on the back half of the show, exclusive for Hub fellows and subscribers, we'll talk a bit about what we've learned in the years since the October 7th crisis about geopolitics and our own societies. But before we get there, we're speaking on the 6th of October. And as we're speaking, there seems to be some developments in play to bring a resolution to the conflict, spearheaded in part by President Trump and his administration. Why don't you reflect on these developments and your optimism that we may ultimately bring an end to this horrific war?
Well, as you say, on this morning, Monday, October 6th, there is a lot of optimism, although less than last week, that a resolution will soon be obtained to end the conflict on sustainable terms. I sincerely hope that that optimism is justified, although I do notice it waned a little over the weekend. But let me express a worry here, or a qualm.
Please.
One of Donald Trump's distinctive negotiating tricks is to announce that something has happened or that something is about to happen, when in fact it hasn't happened and isn't about to happen. And Trump's thinking seems to be that he can sort of trap the parties. If you say a resolution of this conflict is at hand, that takes away the parties' negotiating room and forces them to a resolution on Trump's favorable terms. Yes. But the problem is, despite the titles of his books, Donald Trump is in fact not that good a negotiator. He's not that clever, and he often outsmarts himself. And what he never sees when he does this trick is it's not only the parties, and not even principally the parties, whose freedom of action is taken away when Trump announces a success. It's his own freedom of action that is taken away when he announces a success. And the goal here is not simply to end the shooting. That goal has been obtainable many times. The goal is to end the shooting in a way that is sustainable, that leads to an enduring peace. And among other things, that requires that Hamas not be able to reconstitute itself in the Gaza Strip. But everything we've heard over the past few days indicates that it is Trump who is moving his position, not Hamas. We are learning more and more about what Hamas's position really was, and the original statements were kind of over-optimistic. And we're learning Hamas may be willing to release most, perhaps even all of the living hostages and the remains of the dead. But Hamas's bottom line is they have to retain the ability to reconstitute themselves as the effective government of the Gaza Strip. And on that point, Trump seems to be yielding. So I don't know I'm not so sure that we're moving to a sustainable end of conflict. It may be true that Trump can bully Israel, arm twist Israel into accepting something. But is it something sustainable? That looks less true than it did when this program was first announced. And Trump is boxed in ways that look more inescapable than when the program was first announced.
Virtually since October 7th, and of course the month and years since, the information environment has been marked by a lot of noise, including understanding what at various points have been the principal obstacles to a resolution, and even the internal dynamics within Israeli politics itself. On behalf of our listeners and viewers, try to empathize with a member of the Israeli cabinet. What are your need to haves in terms of any kind of resolution?
From an Israeli point of view, what you need to there's a second question here about what is wrong with the information environment, and we can talk about that in a minute. But here it seems to me are the Israeli requirements. First, they need, of course, to obtain all the living hostages and the remains of the deceased hostages. Second, they need to have some kind of assurance that Hamas is not going to reconstitute itself as it's done at intervals. There have been many episodes of conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza since Gaza took over the place 20 years ago. And what happens is Hamas will seize a hostage. Israel will respond. There will be conflict. and then the conflict will be resolved by Israel getting the hostage back, releasing a lot of Palestinian deadly criminals,
Yes.
often, and in one case, 1,000 to 1, and Hamas maintaining its hold on the strip. And what it retains is its control of the flow of resources from the international community to the people. And one of the things we need to understand is that the United Nations is actually is a party to this conflict, not a combatant, but it's a party because one of the things that we're fighting over is control over the resources that the United Nations brings into Gaza, and they are. For the few million people who live there, these resources are enormous. I mean, more aid goes into Gaza than into all of sub-Saharan Africa. It is so in relative to the size of the local economy, it's the biggest thing going is the flow of UN aid. And who controls that? That means they can control hiring, patronage, all kinds of all the instrumentalities of power. And Hamas is not ready to give that up. And they have weapons of terror to enforce that hold. There are reports, again, I don't know how reliable these are, but that one of Hamas, that people who know the Gaza Strip well can see that Hamas in Gaza is organizing lists of people they want to punish, people to arrest and detain and execute as soon as they can come out of the shadows in order to reassert their authority. So that's a red line for Israel because this is supposed to be the last war, the last of these kinds of wars. The direction we're going in sounds like it's the most devastating of the wars, but not a final one. That the instrumentalities are all in place for Hamas to return to power and do this or try this again.
Uh, David, you alluded earlier to the possible tension for Israeli policymakers between, on one hand, uh, uh, working alongside of what increasingly is one of its few allies in the world, that is the United States, and on the other hand, holding firm on the non-negotiable expectations or principles that you just set out. How does the Israeli prime minister and his cabinet manage those potential tensions?
Yeah, it's a tough challenge because the thing to understand about Trump, especially for something like in the Middle East, which is not existential for him, is he's driven much more by ego and vanity than by any
Yes.
strategic concept. He needs to be seen as a winner. He wants that stupid prize from Norway. I don't know why he cares. You're two-term president. That's a better prize than any prize he wants. But there's a prize. He wants it. Um, but there's something that I don't know if this is actually. I've heard this phrase attributed to Trump. I don't want to say it's a quotation because I'm not quite sure that it's like blue chip. But the Trump is supposed to have said early in his life, "I love making deals." Well, people who are good deal makers don't love making deals. They love the results you obtain from deals, which often requires you to walk away from the deal. But Trump loves that feeling of just he's done something, and the deal it becomes an end in itself. And that's seems to be what is happening here. It takes over for him often the need to get to some kind of declared success, whether there is any success or not. We see this with many of his trade negotiations, where the energy is all to announce that something has happened, even if nothing has happened.
Yes.
So the problem that Israel has things it objectively needs. These are existential threats to Israel. It needs things. Um, Trump needs the appearance of a success, not the reality of a success, because by the time anybody becomes aware that the appearance of success is not real, he's forgotten about the whole thing.
We've put ourselves in the minds of Israeli cabinet ministers. Let's put ourselves, to the extent we can, in the minds of Hamas leadership.
Yeah,
How is it? How is it positioning itself in the context of these
yeah,
negotiations? To what extent is it emboldened by
yeah.
the declaration of a Palestinian state by Canada and others? And how is it bringing to bear those sympathies in parts of the West to try
Yeah.
to secure the best deal that it can?
Well, putting ourselves in the mind of Hamas leadership is very difficult for Westerners because we refuse to believe what they say about themselves. Um,
Yes.
and so we keep projecting this. They say these things, but those aren't real. What's real is if Hamas were kind of like our kind of people who thought like us, here are the things they would really want. These are the things that we would really want. So that's what they must want. So the first step is to understand that Hamas is not a Palestine national liberation movement at all, at all. That's what it says in its charter. For them, Palestine is a completely instrumental program. Hamas is an apocalyptic revolutionary Islamic movement. And the destruction of the state of Israel is to them a step on the way to the ultimate goal, which is the redemption of the world through the reestablishment of proper Islamic sovereignty over much or all of the earth's surface. So the suffering of individual Palestinian people is not at all an important consideration for them. Take it seriously. If you believed that you could redeem the world, usher in a new messianic age for all of humanity, or at least all of Islamic humanity, a billion people, and the price is a little extra homelessness for a few 100,000 people. That would be a price if you believe what they believe, the suffering is well worth it. And that's hard for people in our materialistic, pleasure-driven civilization, where we don't believe that anyone can sincerely imagine a religious apocalypse, to accept. So, from Hamas's point of view, what they need to do above all is retain their control over this foothold on earth that they have got.
Yeah.
And the suffering of the people there is not important. In fact, in a way, it's extra from if you believe in a reward after life. They're not even yes, it's a brief earthly misery, but they will be amply rewarded. Even the suffering people will be amply rewarded in heaven for what they're going through now. And certainly the people who are leading the suffering, they'll be even more magnificently rewarded because they're ushering in this new age of redemption. So take all of that seriously. And if you take it seriously, you can understand that a lot of the kinds of pressure points and this, by the way, is one of the things that's wrong with the Israeli hawk attitude, because there's some idea that you can inflict pain on Gaza and that will matter to the
That's
Hamas
interesting.
leadership. And it clearly does not. It clearly does not. It is like the last weeks of the resistance of the Third Reich. I don't want mean to compare in any ideological way to Hamas to the Nazis, but I mean that like it was obvious by August of 1944 that Germany could not win the war. If it hadn't been obvious long before, certainly, but by the time the Allies are there, they're established in France, Germany's not going to win. That you would think a rational decision maker would say at that point, what's the best deal we can negotiate with the less dangerous? But the Nazi regime did exactly the opposite of what you would expect from, a hedonic maximizer. And as they became more and more clear that Germany was doomed, they tried to maximize the suffering on their own people because their own people had lost and therefore deserved to be punished. And they turned their anger inward. And a lot of that seems to be happening in Gaza too. So this idea that people often attribute sort of secular motives or national motives to a movement that is neither secular nor national, and therefore they misunderstand what that movement wants.
Let's stay on the point because I think it's really insightful and challenges even some of my own thinking about the logical response to Hamas's obstinance over the past several months. In a way, Israel has done what one might logically do, which is to increase the intensity
Yeah.
of the combat in order to induce a surrender and a
Yeah.
resolution. And as you say, that hasn't worked. And in fact, in part, what it's done is reduce support for Israel in Western capitals
Yeah.
around the world. Talk about that asymmetry for a minute, David. What does that mean for Israel, and how should it influence both the ongoing prosecution of the war, but also
Yeah.
these resolution talks?
Well, to look briefly at the Western world, understand look for a moment at the point of view from Western governments, including the Canadian government. So the Gaza war has created a serious public order problem throughout the Western world, expressed most poignantly recently by this terrible murder in Manchester, England, where a man who's literally named Jihad murdered a worshiper and a security guard at a Jewish synagogue in I think I have that count right. And then maybe I think some people were then injured or killed by the police fire, which was not accurately enough aimed and injured or killed some bystanders. I may not have that detail exactly right, so I forgive me if I've garbled any of those details. So there's this public order problem, and the governments everywhere think if we can just get some kind of resolution, uh, we can make our lives a lot easier. And we don't have any way to pressure Hamas, but we do have ways to pressure Israel. So if we can just bring some pressure to bear on Israel, we can then make life safer for our people and easier for the governments in Toronto, in London, in Paris, in Milan, in Barcelona, where there are anti-Semitic or anti-government riots just this past weekend. And so they're like the Western government's in a position of like the old joke about the drunk looking for his key under the lamppost because it's brighter there. You squeeze the people who are more squeezable. And the Israelis are more squeezable by Western governments than Hamas, so that's who they squeeze, even if that's quite irrelevant to any of the um, outcomes that anybody wants. Because um, one of the things I think we've learned from the protests that have happened since 2023 is these movements, although they seize on Gaza as the occasion, are not really very much interested in Gaza. They are quite interested in Israel and domestic Jews, but that's not the only thing. Like if you got a mob in Barcelona that is smashing up stores and banks, ostensibly because of Gaza, and ostensibly to attack Israel, but those stores and banks have no connection. It's not even like attacking a synagogue where there is a kind of community of faith and faith. You're attacking the Nike store. Why? Well, because that's how you express your hostility to the country in which you live.
Yes.
And so whenever you're triggered to up the ante, up the volume, up the violence of the protest, that's what you attack. And now they're doing it again. And these are long-term chronic security problems that governments have. And ending the conflict in Gaza will not really resolve this. It may turn down the immediacy of the noise, but it won't resolve the problem. And that is going to take real kind of police work inside those Western countries.
Final question as part of this first segment of the show. From the afternoon of October 7th, 2023, we've relied on your insight and wisdom to understand what was happening on the other side of the world, recognizing that, of course, we're in a fast-moving moment. Paint a picture of what a possible resolution looks like, David. How do we ensure that Israel secures the things that it needs, as we've been
Yeah.
discussing, and conditions are created for Gazans to
Yeah.
start to live lives of greater security and opportunity?
Well, I could paint a very gauzy picture, as the Trump people do with it's in Dubai, but I think that it's really here's I think the basic. Who is going to go into Gaza and create a system of order and fight Hamas in order to maintain it, and not just one time, but persistently? Who is going to do that? It's not going to be the United States. It's not going to be any consortium of Western countries, and I don't think it's going to be Arab countries either. Um, because what'll happen is, I mean, supposing you have this mythical multinational force that is talked about, Saudis and Egyptians and others, and they go and they try to make sure that the aid goes where it's supposed to go and isn't diverted, there'll be a terrorist attack on them, and quite a spectacular one. And
Yes.
my guess is they break at the first terrorist attack and they clear out, and the place reverts. So who's going to have that mission? And uh, the only people who I mean, the Israelis might have it, but that would be catastrophic and backfire. The only people you can imagine who might have it would be Fatah, who are really engaged and who are weaker than Hamas and less dedicated, but at least have the mission. So if I think that when I think about who's going to go in there and run Gaza, Fatah is the only that is the Palestinian Authority. That's the only. It's Hamas, Fatah, or the IDF, and everything else is kind of a fantasy. So um, that's the mission. That's the problem. But Fatah doesn't look real enthusiastic. And the last time they tried this 20 years ago, Hamas won and Fatah lost.
Yeah. Yes. Sober words. To wrap up this part of the conversation, we'll of course be following these issues closely at the Hub, and no doubt talking to them with you, David, in the coming weeks. We'll end now the discussion for our free members of the Hub community, and pick it back up in a moment to reflect on the anniversary of October 7th, exclusive for Hub heroes and fellows. Bye for now, and back soon. Bye bye. This video has been brought to you by Airbnb. Thank you, Airbnb, for sponsoring the Hub's YouTube channel this month. Governments, as Hub listeners and viewers know, are rightly focused on addressing Canada's housing crisis. But when they spend their time regulating short-term rentals like Airbnb, they're not focused on what matters most. According to Statistics Canada, the number of short-term rentals that could be potentially converted into long-term homes is just 0.6%. Yet Canada needs almost 6 million new homes by 2030 to achieve affordability. A closer look tells us that clearly building more homes, not regulating or restricting short-term rentals, is the only real solution. Learn more at airbnb.ca/closer look.